My name is Emily Spieler. I'm the facilitator, I think, of this session, and I'm one of two people here from the U.S. You'll notice that we have no U.S. presenters, although I do think of the U.S. as the crucible for modern laissez-faire development. So if any of you are eager to know more about what's going on in the U.S., I and Greg Wagner, who's also here, will be happy to talk with you during breaks. But with that, I think that as these themes are evolving through the conference, you will hear some echoed in this session in the three papers we're about to hear, and I'm going to turn this over to Elsa. I might add that the speakers in this session, some may stand at the podium, some may sit at the table, but during the discussion period at the end, we will all be sitting here.
Okay, thanks, Emily, and thank you for inviting me along to present at this really interesting conference. I'm going to be speaking about employment conditions and health and safety in the Australian horticulture sector. Oops, why isn't it working? That's just a brief outline of the presentation. Australia has quite a different approach to getting temporary migrant workers into horticulture, so I'll talk briefly about the visa arrangements for our workforce. I'll summarise very quickly the study methodology that we use to access harvesting workers, look at the substandard employment conditions with respect to pay and health and safety, and then turn to the factors which appear to be contributing to the poor employment and OHS standards in this sector. What's different about Australian horticulture is that whilst we have temporary migrant workers performing the harvesting work, and that's picking, pruning, harvesting fruit and vegetables, what's different about it is we don't rely on temporary migrants from low-paid economies. We rely instead on young backpackers, most of whom, at least in the early days, were coming from Europe and the UK. The government advertises a program which allows backpackers to work in harvesting, and they describe the work as fun in the sun. This is how you entice young workers to come and do what's actually backbreaking work. They provide a 120-page harvest guide which tells backpackers where the work is, or at least it tells them what crops are being harvested in what part of Australia in what months of the year, and it has a very attractive diagram which you can see you could actually do harvesting work 12 months of the year in Australia because of the climate variations around the country. You can start with bananas and pineapples in Queensland and go down to do apples in Tasmania and across to Western Australia to do grapes. But, of course, what we know is that harvesting work is not safe and the Australian bush is particularly dangerous. Here's just a few people who have suffered, I guess is a bit of an understatement. Some reported incidents just in the last month or so. A couple of weeks ago, a young Irish backpacker was scalped when her hair got caught in a conveyor belt in a fruit picking shed a couple of hours north of Melbourne. In the same month, a young Norwegian and a young German both died in a bushfire that swept through the farm that they were working on in Western Australia when they were trying to save a horse. And the third picture there is of a Malaysian undocumented harvest worker. We don't know much about him because he was an undocumented or an illegal immigrant. His body was found dumped in a public toilet in an area that has a huge amount of fruit picking. He'd been fruit picking. He's thought to have died of a medical condition. I'm not sure what we make of that, whether it was a workplace injury or some other condition, but all we can do is assume that he didn't feel safe going to get medical treatment because of the risk of deportation. So just to go back a step and to talk about the visa arrangements. Well, first of all, the agriculture sector is an expanding sector in Australia because of the substantial growth in the export side of the fruit picking industry. It makes up about 2% of the gross domestic product in Australia. It's hard to get a figure of the exact number of workers. It's estimated there's around 130,000 workers in the sector, and the value of output in the last financial year was 37 billion US dollars. Until the late 1990s, most harvesting work was done by local rural workers. There were also permanent itinerants who, again, were Australians who would travel around the country almost as a permanent occupation, but continually travelling to new picking areas. And the work was sufficiently well paid that the urban working class would spend their holidays doing fruit picking work for extra cash. Back in 1975, the Australian government introduced a new visa, which is known as the Working Holiday Maker visa, which is what I also refer to as backpackers. I'm not sure if you know the term backpackers, yes, young travellers. The initial visa was only open to 3 countries. It was open to young travellers, those between 18 and 30 years old, from the UK, Ireland and Canada. They could come to Australia for a year and they could spend as much of that time as they wanted doing any kind of work, so long as they didn't work for more than 6 months with any single employer. It was quite a popular scheme. Over time, the backpackers started to move into harvesting work, and in the 1980s there were reports of backpackers undercutting wage rates in harvesting. And by 2005, the scheme had been opened up to 19 countries. These are reciprocal agreements that we have with countries, and most importantly, it expanded particularly into Korea, Taiwan and Hong Kong. It's a very easy visa to get. You put in an application, 24 hours later you have a visa to come and work in Australia under this scheme, although the work is supposed to be incidental to holidaying, which is why it's called a working holiday visa scheme. In 2005, there'd been a growing shortage of local labour to do harvesting work. The Farmers Federation, the major employer lobbying group, were quite concerned. They were claiming they were ploughing fruit and vegetables back into the field because there's no one to pick the fruit. And so the government amended this visa scheme so that if a working holiday maker worked 88 days in their first 12 months in Australia, they would then be entitled to a second 12-month visa. And for the second 12-month visa, they can work anywhere. So they typically go back to the capital cities where they can party and they work in the hospitality sector. But to get that second 12-month visa, they need to complete a minimum of 88 days work in harvesting, the mining sector or construction. 90% of them complete that work in harvesting because it's so much easier to get work in that industry. This opening up of the second year of the visa scheme had a huge impact on the number of workers coming in through this scheme. When the scheme was restricted to 12 months, there was 96,500 visas issued, and by 2013, over 200,000 visas were issued, and first-year visas, and just under 40,000 second-year visas were issued. So we know from that around at least 40,000 young backpackers have worked in horticulture for at least 88 days. And I say at least because we know there are some backpackers who try and meet the 88-day target, but they don't quite get there, and so they don't get a second-year visa scheme. So we heard of backpackers who got caught out by a cyclone when all the banana plantations were knocked over, and they didn't have enough time to find work anywhere else to actually reach the target, so they couldn't get the second-year visa scheme. More threateningly, you also hear of young female backpackers who are really close to getting their 88-day target, and the only job they can find is in a remote location, 5 hours from the closest town, and they go there on their own just to get the 88-day target met. Another significant change is in the last few years where increasingly the number of young workers coming into this scheme are coming from the Asian countries, whereas traditionally they were UK or European. One of the implications of this is that, in fact, they have increasingly important language barriers. The Asian workers who are coming in are not required to have any English language tests whatsoever, and you can see from that that about 30% of those getting second-year visas are now coming from Hong Kong, most particularly Taiwan and Korea. A couple of months ago, the Australian government announced that they would issue 5,000 temporary work visas under a similar scheme to Chinese youth, this time to young Chinese who'd completed 2 years of tertiary education who can come in and also participate in our harvesting work. So the project that I've been involved in looking at their employment conditions involved doing focus groups, mostly of backpackers in 3 states, looking at those who are doing harvesting work varying from grape picking through to apple picking to lettuce picking and the like. We conducted interviews with farmers, with employment agencies, backpacker owners, backpacker hostel owners, and some union officials and OHS officials. We found from the focus groups that there were substantial regional differences. So, for example, we'd heard that the employment conditions in Queensland were very different from Victoria, and so we did an online survey as well of harvesting workers, from which we got 303 valid responses and responses from across Australia. So looking at their employment conditions and turning firstly to pay, all migrant workers, temporary migrant workers, which we'll call them for the rest of the talk, are entitled to a minimum rate of pay the same as if they were an Australian resident. The minimum hourly rate nationally for fruit pickers is $16.87 an hour. You add on a 25% loading for casuals because they are all casual employees. There's no permanent work here. Then they're entitled to $21.09 an hour, which is around US dollars $15.26. What they were actually getting, though, those who are paid by the hour were getting $16.20 an hour, which is about $5 less per hour than the national minimum rate. About a third of our workers were being paid piece rates, and again there is a national award that specifies what they should be paid for piece rates, and that basically is that if someone's on piece rates, the average competent worker should receive 15% more than the hourly rate, which means that our piece rate workers, if they're of average competence, should be earning $24.25 per hour, although the award also says because it depends on individual productivity, there's no guarantee they'll receive the minimum, and you can see that they don't. Their minimum is even lower than the hourly rate. It's $11.69 an hour. So those who are entitled to hourly rates of pay are getting well under the national minimum rate that they're entitled to, and those who are earning piece rates are earning well under that as well. They also endure substandard health and safety conditions and what we call the routinisation of low-grade risk. What we know about horticulture or agriculture, it's amongst the top 3 most dangerous industries in Australia, alongside mining and construction. The temporary migrant workers that we met are typically separated from the dangerous machinery on farms. They're typically not working but really close to tractors. But they're rarely given anything more than a few minutes of occupational health and safety training, if that, and they're subject to low-level risks and injuries. And you can read the table here, or I can give you a few examples. I mean, you might think a sore back is something you just recover from, but we did meet a young Malaysian girl who 6 months after picking asparagus still had a sore back. We met an Irish guy who couldn't get out of bed for 3 days with a sore back. A young survey respondent who'd been hospitalised following exposure to pesticide, a young British backpacker who on his second day, in fact it was his first day on the farm, by midday he had been dragged under the shade of a tree and was hosed down for 20 minutes because he was dehydrated. So the level of exposure to risks is quite substantial. Turning to factors now that contribute to these outcomes, well, if you look at the labour market employment conditions, we know harvesting work is always seasonal, it's always short-term, and it's always casual. This is highly precarious work. Why these backpackers are particularly vulnerable, in addition, is because they actually don't know much about the labour market in Australia. They have difficulty finding out where jobs are, and yet they're under pressure to complete that work, to complete 88 days of work, which is a lot if you're only getting 3 days' work a week. They're under pressure to complete that 88 days within the first 12 months. To help them out, the government offers an information service which is attached to that Harvest Trail brochure that we started with. That's basically regarded as a failure by backpackers. They don't get useful information from that service. So instead they rely on what we call private sources to find out where the jobs are. And that can be through advertisements on websites, hostels advertising jobs, and particularly word of mouth. We met a group of Korean young girls who had set up their own Facebook site so they could communicate with the rest of their friends around the country about where particular jobs were available. One of the changes that's occurred as the as backpackers have taken over the picking work is that when they travel to regions, they typically stay in backpacker hostels, and those hostels have become major labour market intermediaries. The hostels have the links to the farmers that get them jobs. So backpackers often will go to the hostels knowing that if they stay there, they will get a job. Of course, the worst of the hostels advertise that they've got jobs, and the kids travel a day to get to the hostel, and they get there and there's no jobs. But the backpacker hostel owner, of course, is happy because he's got someone filling a bed. So they may be misled, although about 15% of our survey said they had travelled to an area on false job information. And for these backpackers, time really is money, and time wasted is potentially the loss of a second-year visa. Something which I won't have much time to go into is that farmers are increasingly switching to labour hire contractors, moving away from the direct hire of workers and increasingly moving to undocumented workers. So to sum up the labour market employment characteristics, a lot of this has to be understood in terms of this 88-day target. The backpackers will do whatever work they can get simply to reach their target. Those who have poor English or no English, particularly coming from Asian countries, are particularly captive to the less scrupulous contractors, and they're compelled to accept work under any conditions. And there's just a quote from an Irish backpacker about being forced to work for a contractor where they get between, they get about $5 less per hour than if they're hired directly. The second factor we looked at to explain these outcomes was management practices, and whilst the backpackers are told that they're entitled to minimum standards and they should request minimum entitlements when they go to a farm, the reality is quite different. The government body that enforces conditions throughout all industries has described agricultural farmers, employers, as exhibiting systematic non-compliance with minimum standards. They've started an investigation to try and counter some of the worst of these practices, but their practices are so pervasive that they are struggling to make any inroads. The third factor that's placing pressure on, downward pressure on employment conditions and health and safety are supply chain pressures. And in Australia, the two major supermarket chains where at least half the produce from these farms is sold, the two major supermarket chains control more than 50% of the retail market, meaning that farmers are price takers and have little say in what they actually earn. The government has introduced new policies around getting a better code of conduct for supermarkets in the way they deal with farmers and their suppliers, but even the early stages of that new process have been described as disappointing in the extent that retailers are signing up but actually not acting upon the code of conduct. So just to finish, there's been a substantial change. We've moved from a local workforce to young backpackers, but we're now moving largely to an undocumented workforce which is coming through from Asia, which I haven't had time to talk about here. We know that the employment standards and health and safety standards have fallen and are falling further, as much because of the undocumented workers coming through, and there's a range of factors that underpin this gradual decline. Policy responses are starting to come through, but I'm tempted to think the policy responses are too little and too late. Thank you.